grief is praise. We grieve the things we love. We grieve the things that we honor. And so grieving things is giving them the proper value within our heart.
Hello and warm welcome to The Stories We Tell. I'm Nithya Shanti, a teacher and facilitator of conscious living here at Roundglass. On this show, we share the gift of illuminating stories. Each week, you'll hear a true story from me and a special guest on a universal theme. Stories of self-acceptance, overcoming inconceivable odds, embracing change, and recognizing our limitless nature while honoring our humanity. These are narratives that invite reflection and offer glimpses of our multifaceted world through diverse viewing points. Today's theme is developing resilience through loss. Loss is an inevitable part of life, and while practicing non-attachment may be a step on our journey toward inner peace, losing a loved one or even a valued possession or piece of creative work can be difficult to work through emotionally. If we treat losses we experience as lessons, they can shape our worldview, show us what is truly important, and help us live more mindful, present lives. I'd like to start with some of my experiences around this. When I was around 7 years old, my father suddenly died. He had a small heart issue, which was supposed to be a small, easy surgery. And a few days after the surgery, he quite suddenly passed away. I think in India, people are not sometimes very attuned to how children process things. So I was initially told he's just fine and he's actually recovered. And then when I went to the hospital, I found that he's passed away. So it was quite a shock. That was my first direct encounter with what you call loss. These days, I no longer like to use the word loss because I actually see it as returning. We can only lose something that belonged to us. I see all of these things as borrowed. But at that time, definitely it felt like a loss. I was very shocked that I'd never see my father again. And maybe that was one of the things that put me on a more introspective journey of reflecting on what is this life about. And my father, who was so intelligent and lively and adventurous and capable, rather young, had just passed away. And perhaps that's what drew me later on to things like meditation and exploring some of the deeper aspects of life, that who am I and what is this about and what are the nature of awareness. One thing my teacher said to me is that those who have not reflected on death will find life very confusing. And he used to point out how in society, even though every single day we see news reports of natural calamities and other reasons why people pass on, we are nevertheless very shocked when someone we know passes on. So you hear of an acquaintance or a colleague or a relative who passes on, and most people have a great sense of shock. Oh my goodness, how could it happen? So he said that this is a sign of not really deeply making peace with the fact that everything that arises also passes away. The monastery I practiced in Thailand was a cremation monastery. So the story is that the local villagers, there was a forest grove, and they would use that to cremate. In the tradition, in Buddhist tradition, they cremate the bodies. So they would use that to cremate dead bodies. And because Thai people tend to be a little superstitious and afraid of ghosts, that entire 100 acres was nobody would dare enter that place. So when some of my teachers came and spent several days there, the villagers were very impressed that these monks are not afraid of staying in this grove full of ghosts. And they actually donated that entire land to my teacher. So that's how this monastery began. And it remained a cremation monastery. So every month we'd have at least a few cases where the villagers would bring a person who passed on, and then they would be cremated. And in Thailand, they have open cremations. So the coffin is actually made of thin cardboard. And very quickly, you can actually see, this is not like some sanitized electric crematorium where you just get ashes at the end. You actually see the body burning. There was one occasion where the body had been kept overnight in the monastery. And something called me to go to the main meditation hall where it was kept. And I just decided to put a mat quite right just right next to the coffin, and just spend the night sleeping right next to the coffin. And I wanted to really confront my own fear of death and also my own death. And that night I had some very vivid dreams of my body returning to the elements, disintegrating, returning to the elements. And when I told my teacher about that, he smiled and said, very good. You're getting a sense of the reality of how things are. Your body is made of elements. It comes from elements. It is supported by elements. It returns to elements. No longer think so much in terms of loss. I see it as quite natural that in life things will come and things will go, and people will come and people will go, and experiences will come and experiences will go. And it doesn't mean that it's not sad sometimes or painful, but I don't expect it to be otherwise. And that's been a big insight for me, that to not resist the flow of life, to not resist the way things are. And so I'm very keen today to listen to our special guest, Michaela, who is an embodiment teacher and a relationship expert. Michaela Boehm is internationally recognized expert in intimacy and sexuality and the author of The Wild Woman's Way. Michaela's road to success was not without hardship. In 2012, she discovered the body of a close friend in the California desert and embarked on a 1,400-mile odyssey to return his remains to his family. This traumatic loss and the journey that followed changed the course of Michaela's life. Michaela, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I want to also say, as you started before we actually began this, saying that I think understanding loss and death is something that brings enormous joy in life, of course. And that's one of the things I discovered, that by really making peace with the entire process, life can be, even though painful, also very vivid and beautiful. And so, to kind of tell the story as quickly as possible, my closest friend, who was also my business partner, had moved from Canada to California, where we taught workshops and ran our business. He had been a nurse for all his adult life. He was also a paramedic and did survival training and was really an outdoorsman and a surfer and loved the desert. And so he had nursed his father in the last week of his life. His father had his organs shut down because of a chronic illness. And so my friend James actually got to be there and be in the hospital and nurse his father for the last week of his death. And it was incredibly impactful and profound for him. And so that happened on June 4th of 2011. And then he came to California and we worked together, and we had rented this event space and we were teaching. As the anniversary of his father's death came, he decided to go into the desert and meditate and, just connect with his father. And it was this very special confluence of planets that particular year. And so it was a full moon. And so he set out into the desert. I didn't know where he went. He said, I'm going to be gone for the weekend. I'll be back on Tuesday morning because we're teaching that day. And off he went. And I woke up that Monday morning, June 4th, the day of his father's anniversary, out of deep sleep, and came out of the sleep and went and said out loud, out of deep sleep, I lost James. And then kind of came to and had this really incredible pain in the front of my body and then in the back of my body. And I was so out of sorts, and I was pacing and I was trying to figure out what was happening. And eventually I went back to bed and woke up, thinking maybe I had a nightmare, or, you kind of don't think that what you feel is what's really happened. And so then the next day, I went into LA to go teach this event that we put on every 2 weeks. And I arrived and his car wasn't there. And I knew in that very moment that something really quite, substantial must have happened. I actually sat down. I completely emptied my mind. I kind of settled my energy, which was not easy to do. And I started feeling out to kind of get a feeling of where he was he alive? Where would I have to start looking for him? From that experience, I decided that I was going to drive to Joshua Tree, which is where I felt he was. Drove through the night. It's about a 4.5 hour drive or so. Arrived there, went straight to the police, filed a missing person report. Was told, well, there's no evidence of him being there. The entrances to the park hadn't recorded him, and was then questioned, as to my whereabouts in the last 24 hours. It was very strange and very, very brutal. And I was on one end frantic, of course, inside, but I also was quite focused because I kind of knew he was dead. I just could feel it. We were very, very close, and I had that experience. But I also knew I had to really see things through because it was the anniversary of his father's death. Eventually, they found his car in a campground, and then they started search and rescue, and it took another day and a half till we found him. And at that point, he had been dead for a while. And when I got to actually see him, it was the probably single most intimate moment I've ever had with someone, right? Because the witnessing of his body and the witnessing of his posture and the way he was laying there and the incredible peace that was in his body was so incredibly profound that even though I was, just wrecked with the loss of someone who was so vibrant, and it was so senseless because he was such a survivalist. What happened was he went up onto a big hill looking at the full moon rising, and probably spent the whole night there. And at some point, he went down towards the campground. He was only a 1/4 mile from a campground, but there was scree where rubble, sits on top of rock. So it's very, very slippery. And he was fine. He made it all the way to the bottom. And at the bottom, there was a rock. And he stopped and pitched forward, and his chest hit the rock. And he had a huge hematoma here as well. And so what had happened, from the speed of the slide, his organs hit his sternum, and he burst a vessel right by the heart, and he bled out fairly slowly from what we could tell. And so he got up, he walked a few steps, he laid himself down. He had his arms open, and his stuff was by his side, and his body was wide open. And he had done, lots and lots and lots of preparation and meditation. He was a Zen practitioner as well, had very deep connections with, the entire Buddhist teachings Tibetan Buddhist teachings on how to leave the body. And he had practiced for many years. And to me personally, I felt like he had left in a very beautiful way. But that didn't mean that I didn't have to call his mother. And that was, I can't even, till this day, I can't tell you what that was like.
It's the anniversary of a husband dying, and then you have to call her and tell her this.
I essentially took care of everything that needed to be taken care of, which meant first identification and then cremation. And it was actually very beautiful because I got to tend to his body, and I got to actually see every step along the way through. 4 weeks later, I left my house in Ojai, got his ashes in his car, and then drove all the way to Victoria, Vancouver Island, in the course of 3 days with his ashes, and picked up his closest friend a day in, who came with me for a day, and then did the last day by myself, took a ferry across the water with his ashes, entered Canada. It was just the most, I can't tell you because it was so brutal, but it was also so beautiful at the same time. But it was this epic being able to drive with his friend and tell silly stories and laugh and take his ashes with me wherever I went, because I promised his mother that I would not leave his ashes out of sight for a moment. So I had him in a bag. I had a bag that I had brought from India, which had this beautiful baby Krishna on the front, and that's where James was in. And I would take my little carrier bag into a Denny's and have breakfast, and I would have to take his ashes to the bathroom with me. And then when his friend Kevin came, we went to a brewery in Oregon and had his favorite beer and had him right there. And it was so, it was so heartbreaking, and at the same time it was so epic, and there were so many odd circumstances that were real odd things that happened in the context of that. And then I arrived in Vancouver Island on Victoria, and the hardest moment was to actually part with his ashes. It was so brutal. That moment of handing this bag to his mother was just, it's just so horrible. A 4-week odyssey that ended with us burying his urn, and having a party for him afterwards. And then it substantially changed my life in many ways. It really not only enforced some of the things that I had known, but not felt. And so I had spiritual beliefs and I had ideas about such things, but this was kind of a real felt sense of everything I believed in real life. Cut to 5 years later, I lost my entire property, house, animals, all belongings, everything I ever owned in a wildfire. And it was an incredibly shocking situation. And, it burned for weeks in this whole area. And by the time I came home, there was still, fire all around. And as horrible as that was, and as shocking, and in many ways even more cataclysmic, I had a real understanding of what was happening. And based on my experience with James, I could actually deal with it. And it was this really interesting moment because I came home, I was in Amsterdam, and I had to fly home and get through the evacuation line. And, I had nothing, nowhere to sleep, nothing, right? And I just sat down on the grass behind the smoldering rubble of my house. It was the middle of the night, put a blanket over me and sat there till the sun came up, and just sat and just waited and cried and laughed and cursed and whatever needed to be done. And then I got up and I dealt with, what needed to be dealt with. And that was a direct result of my time in this, in this loss of my friend and teaching partner.
So powerful to bear witness to your story. And I like what you said, that how these are things that at some level you believed, you already had spiritual beliefs, and the fact that you were teaching, at some level you knew these things. And then when these things happen, it just completely embodies you and makes it, like you said, so real. It's like a baptism by fire in a very real way.
Yes.
I think the hardest part for me is to hear that you lost your animals as well. It. I think things can still be replaced, but those are like family members.
That was by far the worst, by far.
So having been through these two, and of course I'm sure you've had many experiences of loss, what insight can you share with our listeners? What is a sensible way for us to navigate? Inevitably there's going to be loss in our life. How can we navigate this?
Well, I think to me, and subsequently when I've worked with people, of course, and I've had some previous experiences. 2 of my closest friends died within 6 months of each other when I was 20. And I saw both of their bodies after their death. And I realized something back then that really helped me later. You can't spiritually or mentally bypass the grief. It doesn't matter that maybe later it's going to be a learning experience, and it doesn't matter that maybe later there's incredible lessons and growth happening in the moment when our heart grieves. And like you were saying with your father, right? Like that shock of that moment where there's a line and there is no coming back from that, right? I think that's
Yes.
such an intense human experience that I think it's important to not skip that. And it's really important to let yourself feel the abject pain and shock and grief. And, there's a real wisdom in when you see people grieving very, very loudly sometimes, but very animatedly, because I read this incredibly beautiful quote by a beautiful teacher named Martin Prechtel. And he was saying that essentially grief is praise. We grieve the things we love. We grieve the things that we honor. And so grieving things is giving them the proper value within our heart. And I think there's something really powerful in that.
Yeah, it's like as opposed to, oh my goodness, you're dealing with the loss. It's like you're honoring something that's been so important to you.
That's right. And I think that's one of the most important things that I can really say, is that when you can allow yourself to feel how much you loved, and that the grief is an expression of your love, there is an honoring and there is a praising. And within that, there is a bodily reaction. And there's also an understanding that when we do that, our body emits all these neurotransmitters that allow us to actually settle our system, right? And allow us to move on and allow us to make sense. And care for those left behind and care for our own bodies. And so I think that's the most important thing, is that we don't draw the conclusion too early, right? That we don't skip the step of the honoring, of the praising, of the loving before we go to the lesson.
Yeah. You're reminding me of my friend here in Pune where I live. Her name is Reena Jinwala, and I met her a few years back, and she said something quite startling to me. She said, Nithya, the purpose of my life is to grieve and to help people grieve. I said, really? Grieving is the main purpose of your life? She said, yes, because it's something we just try to bypass, or we just don't think it's important, or we try to calm people down when they're going through it. And she said, I've been through some really big losses in my life, and I've learned the wisdom of grieving. And my role in life is to tell people, and grieving is not just when you lose your home or you lose a loved one. Even the small like you had a dream, or you really wanted to get a job and it didn't work out, or a new relationship and it didn't work out, or small things. I mean, and just to allow ourselves. And that's what I learned from her, that it's okay to be broken. It's okay to be shattered. One shouldn't try to, like you mentioned the word spiritually bypass. One shouldn't try to use the concepts we've learned. Oh, it's just karma. Oh, it's just consciousness. And it's really, really important to feel that pain and allow it to actually burn through you.
Yes, that burning makes you human, right? And I certainly can say for myself that in all those experiences, I became human, right? And I became very intimately connected to that part too. And I think one of the most disgusting moments of the fire situation was that somebody who I didn't really know, who was, we were in conversations about me teaching at their place less than 2 weeks after the fire, very smugly said, oh, well, now you really get to know non-attachment. And it was like, yeah, no. No, you're a bit early, right? And that's not to say that there weren't now, 4 years later, I can say, there were some interesting things. But also the other thing that I wanted to say about what can people learn is, it's not about the things, of course, right? It's not about the things. Our worldly possessions, we love them. They're beautiful. It's not about the things. But what I discovered is that it's the memories that are attached to things that you're losing when you're losing the things. Right? I used to have this box from my grandmother that her brother had made her, and it was this carved wooden box, and it was probably my dearest possession, right? And it sat on my nightstand, and every morning when I would wake up, the first thing I would see was that box. And then everything about my family that I loved and my grandmother that I loved and who she was loaded up. And once the box was gone, I don't think of her every morning anymore. And so that's, I think, the other thing to know is that when you lose things, you have to keep the memories alive somehow, in other ways. And how we used to do that, as humans, is by stories, like we're sitting here now, right? Stories is what keeps things alive. And I think that's really, really important. Regardless if you lose a human or an animal or a thing, it's the story that can keep it alive and in the body.
One fascinating perspective on grieving came from Joe Dispenza, and he was talking about, I liked his description of grief as neural pruning. And it's very similar to what you're saying, that, a certain event has happened and life is no longer the same. And you're now having to take stock. And like, for example, your friend is no longer alive, or your house is no longer there. And now there are all these memories, there's your whole life, there's your whole identity, and then there is this reality. And the reason grieving is so painful is all of a sudden your entire neural landscape has to prune itself, has to reorganize itself. You have to give it a new meaning. It's okay, so now the house is no longer there. Now my teaching partner is no longer there. And so that's the painful part. The painful part is of those synaptic connections, I imagine, breaking and realigning and recreating. And that's what's so difficult. And if to me, to see that is like it's pruning. It's similar to what you were saying. It's like now honoring this and saying, now how do I move forward with this? And my question to you is, like in both the examples you gave, you couldn't just take a break and sit down and say, okay, let me process this. You had to be in action. How do we keep going and not get completely lost in the activity? Of course, we can lose ourselves in the activity. And that would be perhaps another kind of bypass, because we know that people who sometimes have lost, they just get super busy. They just make the super, I don't want to think about it. So my question is, how do we keep going when we've had loss?
I think that what happened for me, and with the house particularly, was very acute because I had animals who survived. I have horses and donkeys, and there were no more fences, and there was no water, and there was no electricity, and the same with James. I had to search for him, and I drove back and forth and all of that. And what I did, and what I think is very important, is I made sure that first thing when I woke up, I tended to my body. And so the way I did that is that every morning when I would wake up, I just roll out of bed. I have this movement that I do. It's called nonlinear movement, but it's a whole method of working with the nervous system. And I would just roll out of bed. I come on hands and knees. I put my head down, and I just move my grief. And I would just, I'd cry or whatever. But sometimes I wouldn't even do that because you're so keyed up in a certain way. I just move my body and kind of go into what you could describe as a moving meditation, right? Till my emotions ran clear enough that I could get up and do things. And then every evening before I went to bed, I did the same. And so I bookended my day with these 2 moments for myself. I didn't meditate during that time because I felt like I had so much, shock in my body that I needed to move my body to not get frozen. But,
right.
It's still a meditation in the sense that you let your mind eventually calm and your body comes with it. But I think that's an important piece, is that even when you're very busy, you have to do something for your body. The other thing, and this is when you look at, how grieving and funeral rites and loss was handled in older times, right? You can see all these elements. And so the loud grieving, the people who help you grieve and all of that. And that's the other aspect. The other aspect is you have to have community. at least a friend or two who is with you, who doesn't try and fix it, but also doesn't try and make it go away. And in my case, I of course had people who loved James as much as I did. And then I also had other people around here who lost their houses, and we would get together every evening. We couldn't get food or anything. So we had gone from house to house and emptied out people's fridges and freezers and for the people who had been left there. There weren't many of us. Most people had evacuated, and we had a party every evening, essentially. We brought all the food, potluck. We had one neighbor whose house hadn't burned, who had a generator, so we all charged our cell phones, got a shower in, had a warm meal.
Wow.
And wine was flowing and stories were flowing as a means of honoring that the horrendousness of it.
Yeah.
And everybody was grieving, but everybody still had a story to tell. And we all had gone through the same thing, so we could commiserate and at the same time laugh. And I think that's the other part, is community. And when you lose a loved one, of course, people come and hang out and talk about that person. And that's a very important aspect too.
So 2 things you're saying. One is the movement of the body, and letting the grief physically move through, and trusting your body, trusting where you're feeling it, how you're feeling it, being in touch with your breath.
Yeah.
The other one you're saying is community, and a community where you can be authentic, and no one's trying to fix you and say, hey, okay, it's going to be fine. Maybe it's not going to be fine. Maybe we don't know what's going to happen. But just to hold the space for you, to the extent that they can, is what you're saying are 2 very helpful things to move forward.
Yeah, I think and it's always good when you have somebody whom you trust to hold you that way,
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember I was in Malaysia several years back, and I used to do a form of Qigong practice, Qigong and Tai Chi practice. And I met this monk who'd been practicing for much longer than me. And he said, let me teach you something else. So he made me just stand and just do a simple breathing process. And then for the next half an hour, he said, now don't practice anything you've been taught. Don't practice any of the formal exercises, any of the postures. And just let your body do what it wants to do. And in the beginning, I was a little confused. What does my body want to do? I'm not sure. Does it want to do it? Am I making it do it? But I just relaxed into it. And it wasn't that long, it was half an hour. And I just let my body move in any way, strange or not strange, and just let my body move in any way it wanted to. And I was amazed at how good I felt after that, and how alive I felt, and how much more radiant I felt after that. And that was one of my first clear experiences of trusting the wisdom of the body.
Long before we had a functioning brain, our body already knew how to keep us well and knew how to reset itself and be still. And so I'm a big believer that letting the body do what the body can do really helps with grief and loss, and also creates resilience, because once you understand that you have that ability, then your next incident is not as... It's still shocking, it's still horrible, but somewhere in the back of your mind you go, I've been here before. I made it through. Right? And that there's something really powerful in there.
I also want to tap into, Michaela, your understanding of intimacy and sexuality. And let's find a way to connect that also with what we're discussing. How is the journey of a really deep connection with another human being, including a physical connection, how is that supporting us in living a life that's more whole, where even loss is a part of that? Can you tell us your understanding of that?
Yeah, you touched on this a bit earlier when you were saying about your friend who said that every grief has to be, lived. And when you really feel into it, the act of loving someone, right, and the act of connecting your life with someone holds in it the loss of that love, right? And it doesn't have to be that they are leaving you or you are leaving them. Somebody will die before the other, right? Or you will both go, or you will, lose a child, or, all the things that we love the most in the interpersonal space come with that feeling of the loss, which is why the falling in love and the being in love, and then the loving, which is a different thing altogether, right? The actual sustainable relating to a human is bittersweet, and there is a loss and a grief in the love, and a lot of people don't want to feel that, and so they don't let themselves have that depth of connection and that depth of intimacy, because that intimacy carries that grief and carries that loss, amongst other things, of course. So the getting with our mortality and getting with the understanding that all things will end actually makes your relationship much deeper and allows you to actually be with that person, and you don't have to defend against the loss by never actually being with them.
At this point, I'd like to ask you, what is it that, and through our conversation and even otherwise, like, of course, we chose the theme of loss and we've been exploring that in different ways. But I want to ask you, where are you now, and what is most alive in you, whether it's in terms of a teaching or it's in terms of something you're exploring or experimenting? What is something that's really alive in you that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I'll answer the where am I now first, and then that unpacks the other thing. Where am I now is essentially in an interesting place where, of course, the pandemic, as it has for all of us, has made an end to my in-person traveling and teaching. I've had a very active, very fun and very adventurous all over the world teaching life for many, many years. And so now I'm home, and I rebuilt the house, and I replenished my rescue pack of very wonderful dogs who I love very, very dearly, because to me, dogs are saints, right? And the that beauty is what nourishes me personally. So that said, what's most, let's say, important to me at this particular moment in time is to give as much of the both knowledge and the skill that I've developed over the years to other people. I'm very, very passionate about finding ways to make sure people can get into their bodies, even though we have to do it on Zoom. And that's really taken up a lot of my time, to figure out how to transmit these things, even in an electronic medium, so people in their own homes can have the support to not get frozen. And that's what's most alive for me at this particular moment in time, is just refining what can be done so people can have it even though they're not leaving their houses and things like that.
Yeah, I feel your intention, and in a way, since I'm also a kind of teacher, I can resonate with how there's this impulse of something just wants to come through and wants to go on, and it just wants to go on and spark whatever needs to be sparked. And it's not like it's not exactly egoistic that, oh, I want people to know what I know. It's just like something life just wants to move through, and I can really feel that in what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think we've all experienced the depth of your understanding today, and we've been touched by these experiences that you've had. And I'm sure every single listener would have related to a lot that you said and got some aha moments listening to you. Is there any last thing as we conclude our conversation that you'd like to say to our listeners?
The thing that we've touched on, both in what you were sharing and the things we talked about, is just it's a precious life, and as much as we can, we have to love fully, right? As deeply and fully as we can, whatever that takes, so that at the end of it, our heart is given in some way or another. It doesn't necessarily need to be with a partner, can be with a child, can be with a charity, but something where our heart leaves an imprint in the world, I think, even if it's painful. Oh.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for sharing this incredible story. And thank you all for listening in to today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about Michaela's inspiring work, then do visit her website, michaelaboehm.com, michaelaboehm.com. Don't forget to rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're looking for new ways to explore conscious living, then please subscribe and join me on the Round Glass Living app. In addition to this podcast, you'll find courses, classes, recipes, music, and more to help you make positive changes while doing what you love. And look for a bonus episode with Michaela and me discussing her work as an author and relationship therapist.
All the things that we love the most in the interpersonal space come with that feeling of the loss, which is why the falling in love and the being in love and then the loving, which is a different thing altogether, right? The actual sustainable relating to a human is bittersweet.
I was amazed at how naive or untrained I was in human love and how I was just constantly putting my foot in my mouth and I was constantly messing up and I was being so talking about awareness all the time, compassion all the time. I was actually not being very compassionate, not actually being very tuned into the person right in front of me. And that was a huge wake-up call for me, that here I am practicing this for years and I think I'm reasonably good at it, but I haven't even begun.
Here's the interesting thing about this is kind of my bread and butter, right? This is what I do for a living, essentially, what you're talking about, which is people don't understand that what makes a relationship good is not what makes the sexual attraction good.
Tune in next week to hear a brand new episode of The Stories We Tell. Until next time, I'm Nithya Shanti. Goodbye.
The Stories We Tell is a part of Round Glass, holistic well-being at your fingertips. Find out more at roundglass.com.